Way back in 1711, a man named Captain John Dean decided to publish his story. And it wasn't just any story. It was an account of a voyage that spiraled into one of the most brutal, most harrowing survival tales in all of maritime history. We're talking about a story of impossible cold, of a hunger so deep it becomes unimaginable, and of the absolutely horrifying choices people make when they are pushed far, far beyond the brink. So let's dive into the chilling narrative of the Nottingham Galley, because this is a story of survival at its absolute rawest.
I mean, really think about that question. What happens? Because this isn't some hypothetical scenario. For the 14 men aboard the Nottingham Galley, this became their terrifying new reality. And the answer? Well, it would be written in frostbite, in utter desperation, and ultimately, in blood.
So, this whole nightmare doesn't start with survival. It starts with total, catastrophic disaster. A routine trading voyage, smack in the middle of a New England winter, is about to come to a very, very sudden and violent end.
Okay, so they'd been at sea for over 2 months. They're battered by just relentless, awful weather, and by this point the crew is completely lost. For more than 10 days, the sky had been so thick with clouds and fog that they couldn't even take a proper reading to figure out where on earth they were. They were sailing blind in the bitter cold of a December night, and then their long journey came to a bone-shattering halt.
This line from Captain Dean's own journal just plunges us right into those final chaotic moments. He's on deck, peering through the driving snow, and he sees it, white water churning over rocks right in front of them. He screams an order to the steersman, but in the panic and the confusion, the man does the exact opposite of what he was told. The ship hits with this immense, terrifying force, and the sound of splintering wood is just swallowed by the roar of the sea. The fight for their lives had officially begun.
And this is where they ended up. You can't even really call it an island. As Captain Dean himself put it, it was a mere rock, a prison of jagged stone. There was no soil to dig into for warmth, no trees for cover, literally nothing to burn for a fire. This rock was so small they could barely even walk around to keep warm, and it offered absolutely zero natural shelter from the endless, punishing wind, the snow, and the freezing rain.
So in the immediate aftermath, surrounded by the freezing cold and still in shock, the survivors clung to the one thing they had left: hope. The hope that they could escape. But Boon Island? Well, Boon Island was going to crush that hope, again and again and again.
Their situation went from bad to dire almost instantly. Their only food was this tiny amount of cheese that had washed ashore, and that was gone in a couple of days. For nearly 10 days, in the soaking wet and the biting cold, every single attempt to start a fire failed. They were all huddled together in this one tiny canvas tent, and the frostbite got so severe that some of the men found the skin of their legs literally peeling off, along with the nails from their toes. Their minds just began to fray. They lost all track of time, so confused and delirious that they actually ended up celebrating Christmas twice.
Now, despite their weakness, their bodies just racked with cold and hunger, the captain and a couple of other men channeled every last ounce of energy they had into one single monumental task. They were going to build a boat. Using scavenged wood, a cutlass blade that they painstakingly fashioned into a saw, and nails they pulled from the wreckage, they managed to build a small vessel. This boat became their singular focus. It was the physical embodiment of their hope for salvation.
And the moment they launched it, the sea, in what feels like a final act of pure cruelty, just heaved the boat against the shore and smashed it into fragments. Or, as the old text says, it was stabbed to pieces. And with the boat, their only real tools, an axe and a hammer they'd found by pure chance, were lost to the waves. All that work, all that remaining hope, it was just obliterated in a single instant.
They made one final desperate attempt with a crude raft. 2 men volunteered for what they all knew was basically a suicide mission. One was a Swede whose feet were already useless from frostbite, and the other was another sailor. Their crewmates, now too weak to even help, could only watch and pray from the rock as these 2 men departed into the violent surf. Days later, the raft was found on the mainland. The men were never seen again.
With every possible avenue of escape now gone, their food long since eaten, and their bodies completely failing them, the crew arrived at a moral crossroads. And from this point, there would be no coming back.
The first death since the initial shipwreck was the ship's carpenter. He had been gravely ill ever since they landed, and finally his body just gave out. His corpse lay there with them in that cramped, freezing tent until the morning came. a cold, silent testament to their own impending fate.
The men were starving to death. Their only sustenance for days had been rockweed and a few mussels they could painfully pry from the rocks at low tide. And now, lying right there amongst them, was a source of nourishment they had, so far, refused to even consider.
And then, in this bizarrely formal moment, the crew made a proposal to Captain Dean. A young gentleman, acting as their spokesman, asked for permission to use the human carcass, for their nourishment. Dean was, in his own words, amazingly shocked. But what could he do? He was weighing the certainty of his entire crew's death against this single horrific act. And so he consented. And just like that, the taboo was broken. Captain Dean himself, seeing that the others were either too weak or just unwilling, performed the gruesome task of butchering the body. The portions were distributed, and according to the captain, the starving men devoured the raw flesh in a rapacious manner, their primal animal hunger completely overwhelming any remaining sense of horror or decency. This horrifying act bought them precious time. It kept them alive. And just as they were on the absolute verge of total collapse, a flicker of hope appeared on the horizon, a real one this time.
On January 2nd, a boat finally spotted them, but the sea was just too rough for them to land. One rescuer managed to get to the island. He gave them the incredible gift of fire, but his canoe was smashed in the process. Then, unbelievably, the rescue boat itself was wrecked trying to get back to shore. For 2 more agonizing days, the survivors just waited, huddled around their fire, before a second vessel finally arrived and managed to take them off the rock for good.
The man who first reached them was terrified by what he saw. He described these ghastly figures, nothing but skin and bone, wild, staring eyes. He saw creatures that were barely recognizable as human, gaunt, wild-eyed, and their faces, as he noted, were infected with human gore. The ordeal was finally over, but the price they paid for survival, that was permanent. The men who left Boon Island were not the same men who had washed ashore nearly a month earlier, not by a long shot. The physical cost alone was immense. Every single man, except for the captain, suffered a permanent disability from the relentless frostbite. They lost fingers, toes, or, in one case, an entire foot. Their bodies would forever carry the marks of those weeks spent on that frozen rock. But maybe the deepest scars weren't the physical ones. Captain Dean observed a profound change in his men, especially after they crossed that final, terrible taboo. Their quiet, almost religious resignation in the face of death, it turned into something else entirely. He wrote that they grew fierce, brutish, and barbarous. And this, I think, leaves us with the ultimate haunting question. To stay alive, what part of our humanity must we be willing to sacrifice?